The fluorescent lights hummed their usual tired song on the 42nd floor of Meridian Tower as Marcus Williams pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway. It was 2:17 a.m., and the city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board of dreams and ambitions. Most nights, he cleaned these offices in solitude, moving through the corporate landscape like a ghost among the remnants of power lunches and board meetings. Tonight felt different. Tonight, something was waiting for him in the corner office. That would unravel everything he thought he knew about survival, desperation, and the thin line between giving up and holding on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The woman behind the mahogany desk sat perfectly still, a fountain pen clutched in her manicured fingers, staring at a single sheet of paper as if it contained the weight of the world. She didn't notice him enter. She didn't notice anything at all, lost somewhere between the decision she'd already made and the courage to follow through with it. What Marcus found in that room would challenge every assumption he'd ever made about wealth, success, and the hidden fractures that run through lives that appear perfect from the outside. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the person who needs saving isn't who you think it is. If you're drawn to stories about second chances, the power of human connection, and how a single moment of compassion can change two lives forever, you're exactly where you need to be. Now let me take you back to that night when a janitor's simple act of humanity would expose a secret that had been destroying a woman from the inside out. Marcus Williams had been cleaning office buildings for 7 years, ever since the factory closed and took his welding job with it. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady mattered when you had a 6-year-old daughter counting on you for everything from grocery money to bedtime stories. He'd learned to navigate the corporate world as an invisible presence, someone who existed in the spaces between meetings and after the important. People had gone home to their suburban houses and weekend plans. The Meridian Tower was his Thursday night route. 34 floors of law firms, consulting groups, and executive suites that hummed with the kind of money Marcus had only ever seen in movies. He'd been cleaning the building for 3 years, long enough to know which executives left their offices unlocked, which ones hoarded expensive coffee in their desk drawers, and which ones treated the cleaning staff like human beings rather than furniture with legs. On the 42nd floor lived the crown jewel of the building's tenant list, Blackstone and Associates, a financial consulting firm that managed portfolios worth more than most small countries' annual budgets. Marcus had been cleaning their offices for 18 months, methodically working his way through conference rooms that seated 20 people around tables that cost more than his annual salary. The employees were polite enough, the kind of distant courtesy that acknowledged his existence without actually seeing him as a person. Tonight started like any other. Marcus badged into the building at 11:30 p.m., exchanged nods with Jerry, the security guard, and took the service elevator to the top floors. His daughter Emma was safely asleep at his sister's apartment across town, probably dreaming about the art supplies he'd promised to buy her this weekend if he picked up the Saturday shift at the warehouse. The overtime was brutal, but art supplies weren't cheap, and Emma's smile when she showed him her latest drawing was worth every hour of sleep he lost. The 38th floor went quickly. A small accounting firm with 6 offices and a break room that always smelled like burnt coffee and optimism. The 39th floor housed a marketing agency where the employees seemed to survive on energy, drinks, and creative chaos. By midnight, Marcus was working his way through the 40th floor, a collection of smaller firms that shared space and ambition in equal measure. The 41st floor belonged to a law firm that specialized in corporate mergers. Marcus had learned this not from any official briefing, but from the legal documents that occasionally ended up in wastebaskets, the fragments of other people's professional lives that he emptied without reading but couldn't help noticing. Tonight, The lawyers had left behind the usual debris of a long day: coffee cups with lipstick stains, takeout containers from restaurants Marcus couldn't afford, and sticky notes covered in handwriting that looked like it belonged to doctors or people too important to care about legibility. By 1:45 a.m., Marcus reached the 42nd floor. Blackstone and Associates occupied the entire level, a testament to their success in the world of high-stakes financial consulting. The elevator opened onto a reception area that could have been featured in an architectural magazine, all clean. Lines and expensive furniture arranged with the precision of a museum exhibit. Marcus had always wondered what it would feel like to sit in those leather chairs as a client, rather than the person who vacuumed around them. The reception area led to a maze of offices and conference rooms, each one a small monument to professional achievement. Marcus had developed his own rhythm for cleaning this floor, starting with the break rooms and working his way toward the executive offices in the back. The process usually took him about 90 minutes, depending on how much of a mess the consultants had left behind and whether any of them had stayed late to work on whatever financial emergencies kept rich people awake at night. Tonight, the floor felt different. Not empty, exactly, but charged with something Marcus couldn't identify. The air conditioning hummed its usual mechanical lullaby, and the city lights painted geometric patterns on the polished floors. But there was an energy in the space that made the hair on his arms stand up. He'd felt something similar the night before his ex-wife finally left, a sense that the normal order of things was about to shift in ways he couldn't predict or control. Marcus started with the break room, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces that looked like they'd been cleaned by someone else earlier in the day. The refrigerator contained the usual collection of expensive lunches and organic beverages, the kind of food that cost more per serving than Marcus spent on groceries in a week. He'd learned not to look too closely at the price tags on the items that occasionally found their way into the trash, small reminders of the economic canyon that separated his life from the lives of the people whose offices he cleaned. The first conference room was spotless, chairs pushed in with military precision around a table that reflected the city lights like a dark mirror. The second conference room told a different story, with whiteboards covered in financial projections, and coffee cups arranged around the table like the remnants of a strategy session that had run long into the evening. Marcus erased the whiteboards without reading them, emptied the trash, and moved on to the next room. It was in the third conference room that he noticed something unusual. A cell phone sat on the table, screen dark, apparently forgotten by whoever had been using the room. Marcus had a strict policy about personal items left behind by the building's tenants. He reported them to security and let Jerry handle the logistics of returning them to their owners. The policy protected him from accusations of theft and ensured that expensive items found their way back to the people who could afford to replace them. Marcus picked up the phone to take it down to Jerry, but the screen lit up at his touch, revealing a series of missed calls and text messages. The phone wasn't locked, and the preview notifications were visible without him having to access anything private. What he saw made him pause. 17 missed calls from someone listed as David Partner, and a string of text messages that grew increasingly urgent as the timestamps moved closer to the present moment. "Where are you? The board is asking questions. Call me back now. Victoria, this is serious. The audit results came in. We need to talk before tomorrow's meeting." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus stared at the phone, processing the implications of what he was seeing. Victoria. He knew that name. Victoria Chen, one of the senior partners at Blackstone and Associates, the woman whose office occupied the corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. He'd seen her name on documents, on the directory in the lobby, on the brass nameplate outside her office door. More than that, he'd seen her in person, usually leaving the building as he was arriving, a woman in her early 40s who moved through the world with the confidence that came from knowing she was very good at making very important people very wealthy. The timestamp on the most recent message was 11:52 p.m., just 20 minutes before Marcus had arrived on the floor. If Victoria Chun had been here that recently, if she'd left her phone behind, there was a good chance she was still in the building. Marcus had learned over the years that executives sometimes stayed late to work on projects that couldn't wait for business hours, burning the midnight oil in offices that transformed from conference rooms into private sanctuaries after the support staff went home. Marcus pocketed the phone and continued his cleaning routine, but his attention was divided now between his work and the mystery of Victoria Chin's whereabouts. He cleaned 2 more conference rooms and a small kitchen area, all the while listening for sounds that might indicate someone else was on the floor. The building's ventilation system created a constant background hum that could mask footsteps or voices, but Marcus had developed an ear for the sounds that didn't belong to the mechanical symphony of a sleeping office tower. It was while he was emptying the trash in the 4th conference room that he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A voice, barely audible, coming from the direction of the executive offices. Not a conversation, not a phone call, but something that sounded like someone talking to themselves. Marcus paused in his work, straining to hear more, but the sound didn't repeat. He finished the conference rooms and moved toward the executive wing, where the senior partners kept offices that were less like workspaces and more like corporate apartments. These offices were larger, more luxurious, filled with the kind of furniture and artwork that served as both functional necessities and status symbols. Marcus cleaned them with extra care, partly because the partners paid attention to details that other employees might miss, and partly because he developed a professional pride in his work that extended beyond the basic requirements of his job. The executive wing was arranged in a rough L shape, with 6 offices opening onto a central corridor that led to a small reception area. Marcus started with the office closest to the main corridor, working his way systematically toward the corner office that belonged to Victoria Chun. The first 3 offices were dark and empty, their occupants long gone for the day. The 4th office showed signs of recent use, a computer still warm to the touch, coffee cups that hadn't yet developed the ring stains that indicated they'd been sitting for hours, papers arranged on the desk in neat piles that suggested their owner intended to return. The 5th office belonged to a partner named Robert Blackstone, the founding member of the firm and a man whose reputation in the financial world preceded him into every room he entered. Marcus had never met Blackstone personally, but he'd seen the man's photograph in business magazines that occasionally ended up in the building's common areas. The office was immaculate, organized with the precision of someone who controlled every detail of his environment. Even the trash can was nearly empty, containing only a few scraps of paper and a coffee cup that had been rinsed clean before disposal. As Marcus approached the corner office, Victoria Chun's domain, he could see light seeping from beneath the door. Not the harsh fluorescent light that illuminated the rest of the floor, but softer light, probably from the desk lamp that he'd noticed during previous cleanings. The light meant someone was inside, which meant Marcus needed to announce his presence and ask if he should come back later to clean the office. He knocked gently on the door, a soft sound that wouldn't startle anyone who might be working late. No response. Marcus waited 30 seconds and knocked again, slightly louder. Still no response. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which was unusual for executive offices after hours. Most of the partners made a point of locking their doors when they left for the day, a security measure that protected both their personal belongings and any confidential information they might have left on their desks. Marcus opened the door carefully, prepared to apologize for the intrusion and explain that he was just trying to return the phone he'd found. What he saw inside the office made him forget about phones, about cleaning schedules, about everything. except the scene unfolding in front of him. Victoria Chun sat behind her desk, but she wasn't working. She wasn't reading emails or reviewing financial reports or engaging in any of the activities Marcus associated with executives who stayed late at the office. She was sitting perfectly still, staring at a single sheet of paper that lay on the desk in front of her. Her posture was unnaturally rigid, like someone who'd been frozen in the middle of a thought. Her face was pale, drained of the confidence and authority Marcus had glimpsed during their brief encounters in the building's corridors. The desk lamp cast a circle of warm light that illuminated the paper she was staring at, but from his position near the door, Marcus couldn't make out what was written on it. What he could see was the fountain pen in Victoria's right hand, held with the delicate precision of someone who'd been taught that handwriting was a reflection of character. What he could see was the way her chest rose and fell with shallow, controlled breaths, like someone trying very hard not to cry or scream or fall apart completely. Marcus cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her, but needing to announce his presence. Victoria didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge him at all. It was as if she'd retreated so far into whatever was on that piece of paper that the external world had ceased to exist. "Miss Chun?" Marcus said quietly. Still no response. Marcus stepped into the office, close enough now to see that Victoria's eyes were red-rimmed, either from crying or from staring at the paper for too long without blinking. Close enough to see that her hands were trembling slightly, a barely perceptible shake that spoke of emotions held under tight control. "Miss Chun, I found your phone," Marcus said, pulling the device from his pocket and holding it where she could see it. This time, Victoria looked up. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second before looking away, but in that brief moment, Marcus saw something that shocked him more than finding her sitting alone in her office at 2 a.m. He saw fear. Not the kind of fear that came from being startled by an unexpected visitor, but deeper fear, the kind that lived in the spaces between heartbeats and made every breath feel like work. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. She made no move to take the phone. Marcus placed it on the edge of her desk, close enough for her to reach but far enough away that he wouldn't intrude on her personal space. As he did, he caught a glimpse of what was written on the paper that had captured her attention so completely. The handwriting was elegant, careful, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who'd been educated at expensive schools and taught that presentation mattered as much as content. But it was the first line that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. "To whom it may concern." By the time you read this, Marcus had seen enough letters that started with those words to recognize what he was looking at. In his previous job at the factory, he'd known 3 men who'd written similar letters, each one a final statement from someone who'd decided that the problems in their life were too big to solve and the pain was too much to bear. Each time, Marcus had wished someone had found the letter before it was too late, someone who could have said the right words or offered the right kind of help. Victoria must have noticed his expression change because she moved to cover the paper with her hand. But the gesture was too late and too half-hearted, like someone going through the motions of privacy without really caring if their secret was exposed. "I should let you get back to your work," Marcus said carefully, not wanting to leave but not sure what else to say. "It doesn't matter," Victoria replied, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus understand she wasn't talking about his cleaning schedule. Marcus had learned over the years that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words, in the pauses where people decided whether to trust each other with truths they'd never spoken aloud. He'd had conversations like this with his daughter when she was struggling with something at school but didn't know how to ask for help. He'd had conversations like this with his ex-wife in the months before their marriage fell apart, when they both knew something was wrong but couldn't find the language to fix it. Standing in Victoria Chun's office at 2:30 in the morning, looking at a woman who had everything the world told him to want, but who was clearly drowning in something invisible, Marcus felt the familiar tug of a moment that could go in any direction. He could finish his work and pretend he hadn't seen anything unusual. He could report what he'd witnessed to building security and let someone else deal with the complexity of the situation. Or he could do what his grandmother had taught him. To do when he encountered someone in pain, he could stay. "Would you like me to call someone for you?" Marcus asked. Victoria looked at him again, this time holding his gaze for longer than politeness required. "There's no one to call," she said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Marcus didn't fully understand, but recognized. Nonetheless, he'd felt that particular kind of isolation himself, the sense that the people in his contact list were either too busy, too distant, or too wrapped up in their own problems to offer the kind of help he needed. It was a loneliness. That had nothing to do with how many people knew your name and everything to do with how many people really knew you. Marcus looked around the office, taking in details he'd noticed during previous cleanings, but never really considered. The walls were covered with framed diplomas and awards, evidence of a career built on intelligence and hard work. The bookshelf contained volumes on financial theory and investment strategy, the kind of technical knowledge that Marcus respected, even if he didn't understand it. But there were no personal photographs, no family pictures, no evidence that Victoria Chun existed, outside the context of her professional achievements. "I don't know what's on that paper," Marcus said slowly, "but I know what letters like that usually mean." Victoria's hand tightened on the document. "You don't know anything about my situation." "You're right," Marcus agreed. "I don't know about your situation, but I know about feeling like there's no way out of something. I know about sitting in a room by yourself and trying to figure out how everything went so wrong so fast." Something in Victoria's expression shifted, a crack appearing in the composed facade she'd been maintaining. "It's complicated," she said. "Most things are," Marcus replied. "But complicated doesn't mean impossible." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her wrestling with something internal, some decision about whether to trust a stranger with information she'd clearly been carrying alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear her. "There's going to be an investigation," she said. "The SAIC is going to find discrepancies in our client accounts. Money that should be there isn't there. Money that was moved without proper authorization." Marcus didn't fully understand the technical details she was describing, but he understood the tone in her voice. He'd heard the same tone from his co-worker at the factory who'd been caught falsifying safety reports, from his neighbor who'd been arrested for tax evasion, from people who'd made mistakes that seemed small at the time but had grown into problems too big to solve. "Did you take it?" Marcus asked, the question more direct than he'd intended but somehow necessary. "No," Victoria said immediately, "but I should have caught it. I should have seen what was happening before it got this far. The buck stops with me, and when they start looking for someone to blame." She gestured toward the letter on her desk. Marcus thought about his daughter Emma, about the conversations they'd had when she was afraid she'd gotten in trouble at school for something that wasn't entirely her fault. He'd learned to listen for the difference between guilt and responsibility, between taking blame for your own actions and taking blame for circumstances beyond your control. "Who did take it?" Marcus asked. Victoria hesitated, and Marcus could see her calculating how much to reveal to someone she barely knew. "Someone I trusted," she said finally. "Someone who knew I wouldn't question certain transactions because I trusted their judgment." "Where is this person now?" "Gone," Victoria said. "Left the country 3 days ago for what he said was a business trip. Except there was no business trip on his calendar, and the client he was supposedly meeting doesn't exist." Marcus was beginning to understand the shape of Victoria's problem. Someone had stolen money from client accounts, probably over a period of months or years, using Victoria's trust and position to avoid detection. When the scheme was discovered, the perpetrator had disappeared, leaving Victoria to face the consequences of crime she hadn't committed but hadn't prevented. "Have you told anyone else about this?" Marcus asked. "I tried," Victoria said. "I called the other partners, but they're not answering their phones. I think they already know. I think they've already decided how this is going to play out." Marcus thought about the text messages he'd seen on Victoria's phone, the increasingly urgent tone of the partner trying to reach her. If the other partners were avoiding her calls, it probably meant they were already in damage control mode, already figuring out how to distance themselves from the scandal. "What happens if you're not here when they come looking for answers?" Marcus asked. Victoria looked at him sharply, and he realized his question could be interpreted in more than one way. "You mean if I run?" "I mean if you're not here to tell your side of the story," Marcus clarified. "If you're not here to fight for yourself." Victoria picked up the letter she'd been writing, and Marcus could see more of the text now. It was exactly what he'd feared, a final statement explaining her decision to end her life rather than face the consequences of crime she hadn't committed. The handwriting was careful and controlled, but the words themselves revealed the desperation of someone who'd convinced herself that dying was easier than fighting. "They're going to destroy me anyway," Victoria said. "My reputation, my career, everything I've worked for. At least this way, I get to control the narrative." Marcus had heard similar logic before, always from people who'd convinced themselves that their problems were permanent and their pain was insurmountable. He'd learned that arguing with the logic was less effective than challenging the assumptions underneath it. "What if you're wrong?" Marcus asked. "Wrong about what?" "Wrong about them destroying you. Wrong about not being able to fight back. Wrong about this being the only way out." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her trying to process the possibility that her situation might not be as hopeless as she'd convinced herself it was. "You don't understand how this works," she said finally. "In my world, perception is reality. If people think you're guilty, you might as well be guilty. And if people think you're dead, you definitely can't prove them wrong," Marcus replied. The bluntness of his statement seemed to surprise Victoria, and for the first time since he'd entered her office, she looked directly at him without immediately looking away. "Why do you care?" she asked. It was a fair question, and Marcus found himself thinking about how to answer it honestly. He barely knew Victoria. Their interactions had been limited to polite nods in hallways, and the occasional good evening when their schedules overlapped. He had no obligation to get involved in her personal crisis, no reason to risk his job by spending time talking to a distraught executive instead of doing the work he was paid to do. "I have a daughter," Marcus said finally. "She's 6 years old, and she thinks I'm the smartest person in the world. When she has a problem she can't solve, she comes to me and asks for help. And every time she does that, I try to remember that asking for help is brave, not weak." Victoria's expression softened slightly. "This isn't the same thing as helping a child with homework." "No," Marcus agreed, "but the principle is the same. When someone's drowning, you don't ask them to swim to shore by themselves. You throw them a rope." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her considering his words. Outside the office windows, the city continued its late-night rhythm, lights moving along distant highways like blood cells through arteries. The building around them was almost entirely dark, a tower of sleeping offices, where other people's problems waited for morning to resume their urgent demands for attention. "I don't even know your name," Victoria said. "Marcus Williams," he replied. "I've been cleaning this building for 3 years." "Marcus," Victoria repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "I'm Victoria." "I know," Marcus said. "I've seen your nameplate." Something that might have been a smile flickered across Victoria's face. "Right, of course you have." They fell into silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now, less charged with desperation and more filled with possibility. Marcus could see Victoria wrestling with something some internal debate about whether to trust him with more of her story. "The person who took the money," Victoria said eventually. "His name is David Morrison. He's been my business partner for 8 years. We started this division of the company together. I thought I knew him." Marcus nodded, encouraging her to continue. "He had access to all the client accounts because I gave it to him," Victoria continued. "I signed off on transactions without reviewing them because I trusted his judgment. Every time the auditors asked questions, I vouched for him. I put my reputation on the line to protect his decisions." "How much money are we talking about?" Marcus asked. $12 million, Victoria said. "Spread across 15 different client accounts, taken over a period of 18 months. Marcus tried to process the magnitude of what Victoria was describing. $12 million was more money than he would earn in several lifetimes. It was the kind of theft that made headlines, the kind of scandal that destroyed companies and sent people to prison for decades. "And you had no idea?" Marcus asked. "None," Victoria said. "David was careful. He never took large amounts from any single account. He moved money through subsidiary accounts that looked legitimate. He forged authorization documents using my electronic signature. By the time the auditors caught the pattern, he'd already transferred most of the money to offshore accounts." Marcus was beginning to understand why Victoria felt trapped. Even if she was innocent of actively participating in the theft, she was clearly guilty of negligence, of failing to provide adequate oversight of someone she'd trusted. In the corporate world, that kind of failure could be just as damaging to a career as intentional wrongdoing. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "The SEC investigation starts Monday," Victoria said. "They'll freeze all our assets, review every transaction we've made in the past 5 years, interview every employee, and turn our entire operation inside out. By the time they're finished, Blackstone and Associates will be radioactive. No one will want to work with us, no one will trust us with their money, and no one will hire any of us to work for their companies. But if you can prove you weren't involved—" "I can't prove that," Victoria interrupted. "I can prove I didn't take the money myself, but I can't prove I wasn't complicit. I can't prove I wasn't willfully ignorant. And in this business, willful ignorance is almost as bad as active participation." Marcus thought about the letter on Victoria's desk, about the careful handwriting that spelled out her decision to end her life rather than face the consequences of someone else's crimes. He thought about his daughter, Emma, about the conversations they'd had when she was convinced that a mistake she'd made was the end of the world. "What would you tell your daughter if she was in this situation?" Marcus asked. "I don't have a daughter," Victoria replied. "But if you did," Marcus pressed, "if someone you cared about was facing something that seemed impossible, what would you tell them?" Victoria considered the question for a moment. "I'd tell them that nothing is really impossible until you stop trying to solve it. So why doesn't that apply to you?" Victoria looked at him sharply, and Marcus could see that his question had hit something she hadn't expected to confront. "Because it's different when it's your own life. Because sometimes the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of giving up." "What's the cost of fighting?" Marcus asked. "Years of legal battles," Victoria said. "Bankruptcy. Professional exile. Having my name associated with one of the biggest financial scandals in recent history. Watching my parents read about my disgrace in the newspapers. And what's the cost of giving up?" Victoria gestured toward the letter on her desk. "This conversation never happens. The investigation focuses on David where it belongs. My parents remember me as successful rather than scandalous. The clients get their money back from my life insurance policy." Marcus stared at her, processing the twisted logic of her plan. "You think killing yourself will help the clients get their money back?" "I have a $10 million life insurance policy," Victoria said. "It's not enough to cover everything David stole, but it's a start. And it would prove that I wasn't part of the scheme, because guilty people don't usually commit suicide to help their victims. The reasoning was so flawed that Marcus didn't know where to begin challenging it. "Insurance companies don't pay out on suicides," he said finally. "They do after 2 years," Victoria replied. "I've had the policy for 4 years." Marcus realized that Victoria had thought through the practical details of her plan with the same methodical precision she probably applied to financial analysis. She'd researched the insurance implications, calculated the potential benefit to the victims, and convinced herself that her death would solve more problems than her life. "What about the other partners?" Marcus asked. "What about Robert Blackstone? Doesn't he have a responsibility to help you fight this?" Victoria's expression darkened. "Robert's first priority is protecting the firm. If sacrificing me protects the rest of the company, that's what he'll do. It's what I would do in his position." Marcus thought about the office he'd cleaned earlier, the immaculate space that belonged to the firm's founding partner. He wondered if Robert Blackstone had any idea what was happening in Victoria's office right now, if he would care even if he knew. "Have you asked him for help?" Marcus asked. "I tried calling him earlier tonight," Victoria said. "He didn't answer." None of them answered. Marcus remembered the text messages on Victoria's phone, the increasingly urgent attempts to reach her from someone named David, but that David was apparently the partner trying to reach her, not the David who had stolen the money and fled the country. The situation was more complicated than he'd initially understood. "The David who's been calling you," Marcus said. "That's not the same David who took the money?" "No," Victoria said. "David Morrison is the one who stole the money. David Park is one of the other partners. He's been trying to reach me because the audit results came in this afternoon. He wants to strategize about how to handle the investigation." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. If one of the other partners was actively trying to reach Victoria, it might mean the firm wasn't planning to abandon her completely. It might mean there was still a chance to fight back. "What if David Park is calling because he wants to help you?" Marcus asked. "What if he's calling because he wants to coordinate our stories?" Victoria replied. "What if he's calling because he needs to know how much I know about what David Morrison was doing?" Marcus could see that Victoria's trust in her colleagues had been so thoroughly shattered that she was having trouble accepting the possibility that anyone might want to help her. The betrayal she'd experienced from David Morrison had poisoned her ability to believe in anyone's good intentions. "There's only one way to find out," Marcus said, gesturing toward Victoria's phone. Victoria looked at the device as if it were something dangerous. "I can't," she said. "I'm not ready to have that conversation yet. When will you be ready?" Marcus asked. "I won't," Victoria said. "That's the point. That's why I was writing." She gestured toward the letter on her desk. Marcus felt the conversation circling back to the central problem, Victoria's conviction that death was preferable to facing the uncertainty of fighting for her life and career. He understood the appeal of that logic, the way it promised to end the anxiety and fear that were clearly consuming her. But he also understood something that Victoria seemed to have forgotten, that the people who cared about her would have to live with the consequences of her decision long after she was gone. "Who's going to find your body?" Marcus asked. The question was harsh, deliberately so, and Victoria flinched as if he'd slapped her. "What? When you don't show up for work tomorrow, who's going to come looking for you? Who's going to find your body and have to live with that image for the rest of their lives?" Victoria's face went pale. I hadn't thought about that. "And who's going to tell your parents? Who's going to plan your funeral? Who's going to spend the rest of their lives wondering if they could have done something to save you?" Marcus could see that his questions were forcing Victoria to confront aspects of her plan that she'd avoided thinking about, the human consequences that extended beyond her own pain and fear. I thought it would be easier for everyone," Victoria said quietly. "Easier than what?" Marcus asked. "Easier than letting them help you fight?" Easier than giving them a chance to prove they care about you more than they care about money or reputation. Victoria was crying now, tears falling silently onto the letter she'd been writing. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it to her without saying anything. She took it gratefully, wiping her eyes and trying to compose herself. "I'm scared," Victoria said, the words barely audible. "Of course you are," Marcus replied. "You're facing something terrifying. But being scared doesn't mean you're helpless. It just means you're human." They sat in silence for a few minutes, Victoria crying quietly while Marcus tried to think of what to say next. Outside the office windows, the city continued its late-night rhythm, oblivious to the crisis unfolding 42 floors above the street. Marcus thought about his daughter Emma, probably asleep in her bed at his sister's apartment, trusting that her father would come home safely from work and be there when she woke up. What would Emma say if she knew about this conversation? Victoria asked suddenly. Marcus was surprised by the question. "About you, or about me?" "About you," Victoria said. About her father staying up all night, talking to a stranger instead of coming home. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think she'd understand," he said finally. "Emma has a pretty good sense of when someone needs help. She'd probably ask me why I didn't invite you over for breakfast." Victoria smiled slightly through her tears. "She sounds like a remarkable little girl." "She is," Marcus said. "She's the reason I get up every morning. She's the reason I work 2 jobs and go to school on weekends to get my degree. She's the reason I believe that tomorrow can be." Victoria stared at her phone for nearly 10 minutes after Marcus left to finish his cleaning rounds. The device seemed to pulse with potential energy, 17 missed calls representing 17 opportunities to step back from the edge she'd been approaching. The office felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a crossroads. The letter she'd been writing lay folded beneath her left hand, its careful words suddenly feeling like artifacts from someone else's life. Marcus had promised to return. Before leaving the building, giving her time to think without the pressure of an immediate decision. The silence that filled the office now wasn't the same oppressive quiet that had driven her to write those final words. It was contemplative silence, the kind that accompanied important decisions rather than desperate ones. She picked up the phone and scrolled through David Park's messages again, reading them with fresh eyes. The urgency she'd initially interpreted as panic now seemed more like concern. The repeated attempts to reach her might not be about damage control or self-preservation. They might simply be about a colleague trying to help her navigate an impossible situation. Victoria had known David Park for 6 years, ever since he'd joined Blackstone and Associates as a junior partner specializing in international investments. He'd built his reputation on careful analysis and conservative strategies, the kind of methodical approach that attracted clients who valued stability over spectacular returns. More importantly, he'd never shown any interest in office politics, or the kind of maneuvering that characterized some of their colleagues' behavior during stressful periods. The timestamp on his most recent message was 11:47 p.m., just minutes before Marcus had arrived on the floor. If David was still awake at this hour, still trying to reach her, it probably meant the situation was even more urgent than she'd realized. It also meant she had at least one ally in the firm, someone who wasn't ready to sacrifice her to protect the company's reputation. Victoria took a deep breath and dialed David's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with relief and exhaustion. "Victoria, thank God. Where are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "I'm in my office," Victoria said, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. "I saw your messages, but I needed time to think before calling back." "Listen, we need to meet," David said. "Tonight, if possible. There are things about the audit that you need to know, things that change everything." Victoria felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. "What kind of things?" "Not over the phone," David said. Can you meet me at the office? I'm already here, in conference room C. Victoria looked around her office, at the letter on her desk and the phone Marcus had returned to her. An hour ago, she'd been convinced that her story was ending. Now it seemed like it might just be beginning a new chapter. I'll be right there, she said. Conference room C was located in the center of the floor, away from the windows and the distracting lights of the city. Victoria found David sitting at the long table with his laptop open and several stacks of documents spread around him. He looked like he'd been there for hours, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by stress and fatigue. When he saw her enter, his expression shifted from relief to concern. "You look terrible," he said bluntly. "Thank you for that professional assessment," Victoria replied, managing a weak smile as she sat down across from him. David studied her face more carefully. "I mean it, Victoria. You look like you haven't slept in days, and your eyes are red. Have you been crying?" Victoria had forgotten about her earlier breakdown, about the tears she'd shed while talking to Marcus. She touched her face self-consciously, realizing that her carefully maintained professional facade had completely crumbled. "It's been a difficult evening," she said. "I can imagine," David said. "But before we go any further, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Victoria tensed, preparing herself for the question she'd been dreading: whether she'd known about David Morrison's theft, whether she'd been complicit in the scheme that had destroyed their client's trust and their firm's reputation. "Did you know?" David asked. "Did you have any idea what Morrison was doing?" "No," Victoria said immediately. "I had no idea. I trusted him completely. I signed off on transactions without reviewing them because I believed he was acting in our client's best interests." David nodded, his expression suggesting that he'd expected this answer. "That's what I told the other partners when they asked me the same question. I've worked with you for 6 years, Victoria. I've watched you make decisions under pressure, seen how you treat clients and colleagues. You're many things, but you're not a thief." The simple declaration of faith hit Victoria harder than she'd expected. For the past 3 days, she'd been so focused on preparing for accusations and defending herself against suspicions that she'd forgotten some people might actually believe in her innocence. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," David said. "Because while I believe you're innocent, proving it is going to be complicated." Morrison was very careful about how he structured the thefts. Almost every transaction required your electronic authorization, and your signature appears on dozens of documents that approved questionable transfers. Victoria felt her brief spark of hope beginning to dim. "So even though I didn't know what he was doing, I'm still responsible for enabling it." "That's what I thought too, until I started digging deeper into the audit results," David said. He opened his laptop and turned it toward her, revealing a spreadsheet filled with transaction details and authorization codes. "Look at this carefully. Do you see anything unusual about the timing of these approvals?" Victoria studied the screen, her trained eye quickly identifying patterns in the data. The transactions were clustered around specific dates, all of them times when she'd been traveling for business or working remotely from client sites. More importantly, the electronic timestamps showed that many of the approvals had been processed outside of normal business hours, often in the middle of the night or early morning. "These approvals were processed when I wasn't even in the office," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger as she realized the implications. "Some of them were processed when I was on a plane to London, when I couldn't possibly have been accessing our computer systems." "Exactly," David said. "And look at this." He clicked to another screen, revealing a detailed log of computer access records. "Morrison had been using your login credentials to approve transactions. He somehow got hold of your passwords and security codes, then used them to authorize transfers while you were away from the office." Victoria stared at the data, processing what David was showing her. If Morrison had been using her computer access without her knowledge, it meant she wasn't just innocent of intentionally participating in the theft. It meant she was a victim of identity fraud, someone whose professional credentials had been stolen and misused. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "At least 18 months, David said. "Maybe longer." Morrison was sophisticated about it. He never used your credentials when you were in the office, never processed large transactions. That might trigger automatic alerts, never did anything that would leave an obvious trail leading back to unauthorized access. "But the auditors found it," Victoria said. "The auditors found the missing money," David corrected. "They didn't initially realize that your authorizations were fraudulent. It wasn't until I started cross-referencing the transaction times with your travel schedule that the pattern became clear." Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward David that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. While she'd been preparing to give up everything, including her life, he'd been working to prove her innocence. While she'd been convinced that her colleagues were ready to sacrifice her, at least one of them had been fighting for her. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" she asked. "Why didn't you tell me about this when you first discovered it?" David looked uncomfortable. "I tried to reach you this afternoon, but you didn't answer your phone. Then I tried again this evening, and you still didn't respond. I was starting to worry that something had happened to you." Victoria realized that her decision to avoid her colleagues' calls had nearly prevented her from learning about evidence that could save her career and her reputation. If she had followed through with the plan she'd been contemplating, David's discoveries would have been meaningless. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was overwhelmed. I thought everyone was calling to blame me or ask me to take responsibility for something I didn't do." "The other partners are scared," David admitted, "but they're not stupid. They know that. Throwing you under the bus won't solve the fundamental problem, which is that a trusted employee managed to steal $12 million without anyone noticing for 18 months. "What do they want to do?" Victoria asked. "They want to cooperate fully with the SEC investigation," David said. "They want to provide evidence that Morrison acted alone, that he used fraudulent authorizations to cover his tracks, and that the firm's other partners had no knowledge of his activities." Victoria felt another wave of relief wash over her. The partners weren't planning to sacrifice her to protect themselves. They were planning to present a united front against the real perpetrator of the crimes that had nearly destroyed her. "And you think the CSEC will accept that explanation?" she asked. "I think the evidence is compelling," David said, "especially when combined with Morrison's sudden departure from the country and his attempts to access offshore accounts that he established without the firm's knowledge." David clicked to another screen on his laptop, revealing financial records that Victoria had never seen before. The documents showed a complex network of shell companies and foreign bank accounts, all of them connected to David Morrison, but hidden from the firm's official records. "Where did you get these?" Victoria asked. "Morrison wasn't as careful about covering his tracks as he thought," David said. "He used the firm's computer systems to research offshore banking regulations and to communicate with foreign financial institutions. Our IT department was able to recover deleted emails and browsing history that shows he'd been planning this theft for over 2 years." Victoria studied the evidence David was showing her, gradually understanding the scope of Morrison's betrayal. He hadn't simply stolen money opportunistically. He'd engaged in a sophisticated long-term scheme that involved establishing false identities, creating fictitious business entities, and manipulating the firm's authorization systems. "This is actually good news," Victoria said, surprising herself with the optimism in her voice. "It's very good news," David agreed. "Morrison's greed worked in our favor. If he'd stolen smaller amounts and been more careful about covering his tracks, we might never have been able to prove that he acted alone. But his ambition led him to create a paper trail that clearly establishes his guilt and your innocence." Victoria leaned back in her chair, feeling lighter than she had in days. The weight of shame and responsibility that had been crushing her was beginning to lift, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: righteous anger. "I trusted him," she said. "I vouched for him to clients, defended his decisions to auditors, recommended him for promotions. He used my trust to destroy everything I've worked for." "Your trust wasn't misplaced," David said gently. "Morrison fooled everyone, not just you. He had excellent credentials, stellar recommendations from his previous firm, and 8 years of apparently solid performance. There was no reason to suspect he was capable of something like this. But I should have been more careful," Victoria sighed. "I should have maintained better oversight of his activities, required more documentation for unusual transactions, implemented better security protocols." "All of that is true," David agreed. "But institutional failures aren't the same as criminal culpability. The SEC will probably require us to implement stronger oversight procedures and improved security measures, but they're not going to prosecute you for trusting a colleague who had never given you reason to doubt his integrity." Victoria felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than despair. The future she'd been convinced was impossible was beginning to seem not just possible but probable. She could survive this scandal. Her career could recover from this betrayal. Her life could continue beyond this crisis. "What happens next?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, we meet with the other partners and coordinate our response to the SEC investigation," David said. "We present the evidence of Morrison's fraud, provide full documentation of the authorization breaches, and demonstrate our commitment to cooperating with law enforcement efforts to recover the stolen money." "And you think the partners will support this approach?" Victoria asked. "I know they will," David said. "Robert Blackstone spent 3 hours this evening reviewing the evidence I compiled. He's convinced that fighting this investigation is not only the right thing to do, it's also the best business decision. Throwing you to the wolves won't protect the firm's reputation, but successfully prosecuting the real perpetrator will." Victoria thought about Robert Blackstone, the founding partner whose opinion carried enormous weight in the firm's decision-making process. If he was convinced of her innocence and committed to fighting for her, the other partners would almost certainly follow his lead. "I owe you an enormous debt," Victoria said to David. "You don't owe me anything," David replied. "You would have done the same thing for me if our positions were reversed. That's what colleagues do for each other." Victoria realized that David was right. If one of her partners had been facing a similar crisis, she would have worked just as hard to uncover evidence of their innocence. The loyalty and professional solidarity she'd always tried to demonstrate to others was now being returned to her when she needed it most. "I almost did something terrible tonight," Victoria said quietly. David looked at her with concern. "What do you mean?" Victoria hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about how close she'd come to giving up entirely. The letter she'd been writing was still on her desk, a reminder of how desperate she'd felt just a few hours earlier. "I was convinced that my career was over," she said finally. "I was convinced that everyone would assume I was guilty, that I'd never be able to prove my innocence, that I'd spend the rest of my life being known as the person who enabled one of the biggest financial frauds in recent history. And now?" David asked. "Now I'm angry," Victoria said. "I'm angry at Morrison for betraying my trust. I'm angry at myself for being naive enough to trust him so completely. And I'm ready to fight to clear my name and protect the firm we've all worked so hard to build." David smiled, the first genuine smile Victoria had seen from him all evening. "Good," he said, "because we're going to need that anger. The investigation is going to be intensive and invasive. They're going to scrutinize every decision you've made, every client interaction you've had, every transaction you've been involved with. You're going to need to be strong and focused to get through it." Victoria thought about the conversation she'd had with Marcus, about his suggestion that fighting was harder than giving up, but ultimately more worthwhile. She was beginning to understand what he'd meant. Facing the SEC investigation would be difficult and stressful, but it would also give her a chance to prove her integrity and rebuild her reputation. "I'm ready," she said. David began packing up his laptop and the documents he'd been reviewing. "I suggest you go home and get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day, and you'll need to be sharp for the meetings with the partners and the preliminary discussions with the investigators." Victoria nodded, but she made no move to leave the conference room. She was thinking about Marcus, about the janitor who'd found her at her lowest moment and talked her back from the edge of despair. She wanted to thank him for his kindness, to let him know that his intervention had made a difference. "David," she said, "do you know anything about the cleaning staff in this building? Specifically, a man named Marcus Williams?" David looked puzzled by the question. "Not really. Why?" "I had an interesting conversation with him tonight," Victoria said. "He helped me gain some perspective on my situation. I'd like to find a way to thank him properly." "I could ask building security for his contact information," David offered. "Or you could leave a note with the front desk asking him to get in touch with you." Victoria considered both options, but neither felt adequate for what Marcus had done for her. He'd saved her life, quite literally, and a simple thank you note seemed insufficient acknowledgement of that gift. "I'll figure something out," she said. David gathered his materials and headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Victoria," he said, "I'm glad you didn't do anything terrible tonight. The firm needs you, and more importantly, you deserve to see this through to the end." After David left, Victoria remained in the conference room for several more minutes, processing everything she'd learned and trying to adjust her mental framework from despair to determination. The evidence David had uncovered changed everything about her situation, transforming her from a potential co-conspirator into a clear victim of professional fraud. More than that, David's willingness to spend hours investigating the case and building evidence of her innocence had reminded her that she wasn't facing this crisis alone. She had colleagues who believed in her, partners who were willing to fight for her, and resources available to help her prove the truth about what had happened. Victoria eventually made her way back to her office, where the letter she'd been writing still lay on her desk. She picked it up and read through the carefully crafted words, trying to understand how she'd reached such a dark place, that death had seemed preferable to fighting for her life and reputation. The letter was articulate and thoughtful, explaining her decision with the same logical precision she brought to financial analysis. But reading it now, Victoria could see the flawed assumptions underlying her reasoning. She'd convinced herself that the investigation would inevitably conclude with her disgrace, that her colleagues would abandon her to protect themselves, and that her clients would never trust her again. All of those assumptions had proven false. The investigation might actually clear her name rather than destroy it. Her colleagues were rallying to support her rather than distancing themselves from her. And her clients would be more likely to trust her after learning that she'd been a victim of fraud rather than a perpetrator of it. Victoria folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, not as something to act upon, but as a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change in the space of a few hours. This morning, she'd believed her situation was hopeless. Tonight, she was preparing to fight for her career and her reputation with evidence that could prove her innocence. She thought again about Marcus Williams, about the conversation that had given her enough perspective to call David Park instead of following through with her original plan. Marcus had been right about the importance of fighting rather than giving up, about the possibility that her situation wasn't as hopeless as she'd believed, and about the value of asking for help when facing problems too large to solve alone. Victoria turned off her office lights and gathered her things, preparing to leave the building and go home to rest before tomorrow's crucial meetings. As she walked toward the elevator, she noticed that the cleaning cart was no longer visible. In the hallway, suggesting that Marcus had finished his work and left for the night. She felt a pang of regret at missing the opportunity to tell him how much their conversation had meant to her, to let him know that his kindness had literally saved her life. But she also felt a sense of anticipation about the possibility of finding him again, of expressing her gratitude properly, and of learning more about the man who'd shown such wisdom and compassion during her darkest hour. The elevator arrived quickly, and as Victoria descended toward the lobby, she reflected on how different this ride felt compared to the one she'd taken earlier in the evening. When she'd arrived at the office, she'd been consumed by despair and convinced that her problems were insurmountable. Now she was leaving with hope and determination, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The lobby was nearly empty at this hour, with only a security guard remaining to monitor the building overnight. Victoria signed out at the front desk and walked toward the parking garage, where her car waited in its reserved spot. The city streets were quiet, but not deserted, populated by late-night workers, early morning commuters, and the various people whose lives operated on schedules different from the conventional business world. As Victoria drove home through the mostly empty streets, she thought about the complexity of the investigation she was about to face, the media attention the case would probably generate, and the long process of rebuilding trust with clients who'd been victimized by Morrison's fraud. All of these challenges seemed manageable now, difficult, but not impossible. Obstacles that could be overcome with proper preparation and professional support. More than that, Victoria found herself thinking about the broader implications of the evening's events, about the assumptions she'd made about her colleagues' loyalty, about the importance of asking for help when facing overwhelming problems, and about the unexpected sources of wisdom and support that could emerge during times of crisis. Marcus Williams had no advanced degrees in finance, no professional credentials in counseling, and no formal training in crisis intervention. But he'd possessed something more valuable than technical expertise, the human capacity to recognize pain, to offer compassion without judgment, and to help someone find hope in what had seemed like a hopeless situation. Victoria realized that she'd spent so much time focusing on the professional aspects of her crisis that she'd lost sight of its fundamentally human dimensions. The theft Morrison had committed wasn't just a financial crime. It was a betrayal of trust, a violation of the relationships that made professional collaboration possible. Her response to the crisis couldn't be purely technical either. It had to acknowledge the emotional and personal impact of what had happened. By the time Victoria reached her apartment, she'd begun to formulate a plan that went beyond simply clearing her name and protecting her career. She wanted to understand how Morrison had been able to exploit the firm's system so effectively, to identify the institutional vulnerabilities that had made his fraud possible, and to implement changes that would prevent similar betrayals in the future. More importantly, she wanted to find ways to support other professionals who might face similar crises, people who might be unfairly blamed for the actions of colleagues they'd trusted, people who might be tempted to give up rather than fight for their reputations and their futures. Victoria's apartment was a reflection of her professional success: expensive furniture, original artwork, and a view of the city that reminded her daily of how far she'd come from her modest background. But tonight, the apartment felt different, less like a monument to her achievements and more like a foundation for whatever came next. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her balcony, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the conversation she'd had with Marcus about his daughter Emma. Marcus had described a little girl who believed her father was the smartest person in the world, who came to him for help with problems she couldn't solve alone, who trusted that asking for help was brave rather than weak. Victoria realized that she'd lost touch with that kind of trust, that willingness to believe that other people might want to help rather than exploit her vulnerabilities. Her professional training had taught her to be cautious, to verify claims before accepting them, to protect herself against fraud and deception. But that same training had also made her suspicious of genuine offers of assistance, reluctant to reveal weakness or uncertainty, and convinced that she had to solve every problem independently. The conversation with Marcus had reminded her that asking for help could be an act of courage rather than an admission of failure, that accepting support from others could be a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. If she hadn't been willing to trust a janitor with her pain, she might never have lived long enough to discover the evidence that could clear her name. As Victoria finished her wine and prepared for bed, she made a mental note to find Marcus Williams and thank him properly for his intervention. She also made a commitment to approach the coming investigation with the same openness to help and support that had saved her life tonight. The investigation would be difficult, but it would also be an opportunity to demonstrate her integrity, to prove her innocence, and to rebuild trust with the clients and colleagues who mattered most to her professional future. More than that, it would be a chance to transform a personal crisis into a platform for positive change, both for herself and for the firm she'd worked so hard to help build. Victoria fell asleep that night with a sense of anticipation rather than dread, looking forward to the challenges ahead rather than trying to escape from them. The woman who'd been writing a suicide letter just hours earlier was now preparing to fight for her career, her reputation, and her future with the full support of colleagues who believed in her innocence and the compelling evidence that could prove it. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but it had begun, sparked by a conversation with a stranger who'd seen past her professional facade to recognize the human being underneath, someone worth saving, someone worth fighting for, someone whose story was far from over. Marcus arrived at work the following evening with an unusual sense of anticipation. Throughout the day, while completing his shift at the warehouse and picking up Emma from his sister's apartment, he'd found himself thinking about Victoria Chun and wondering whether she'd followed through on calling her colleague. The conversation in her office had stayed with him, not just because of its intensity, but because it reminded him of his own moments of desperation when he'd felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. Emma had noticed his distraction during dinner, commenting that he seemed thinky while they shared pizza and worked on her art project. She wasn't wrong. Marcus had been processing the encounter with Victoria, trying to understand why a successful executive would reach such a point of despair and what it meant that he'd been the one to find her at that crucial moment. The Meridian Tower felt different tonight, charged with an energy that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Jerry, the security guard, mentioned that there had been unusual activity in the building during the day, with several police officers and people in expensive suits visiting the upper floors. Marcus nodded politely but didn't ask for details. In his experience, the less he knew about the building's business affairs, the better his job security. As Marcus began his cleaning routine, he found himself paying closer attention to the 42nd floor than usual. The offices of Blackstone and Associates showed signs of intensive activity, conference rooms with whiteboards covered in notes, multiple coffee cups in various stages of consumption, and wastebaskets filled with documents that suggested important meetings had taken place. Victoria's office was empty when Marcus reached it around 1:30 a.m., but her desk showed clear evidence that she'd been working there earlier in the day. Legal pads covered with handwritten notes were stacked neatly beside her computer, and a bouquet of flowers sat in a vase near the window with a card that Marcus carefully avoided reading. The scene suggested that Victoria had not only survived the previous night's crisis, but had returned to work with renewed purpose. Marcus was emptying the wastebasket in Victoria's office when he heard voices coming from the conference room down the hall. The conversation was muffled but clearly animated, with multiple people speaking in the urgent tones that accompanied important business discussions. Marcus finished his work in Victoria's office and moved toward the conference room, planning to clean the adjacent offices while waiting for the meeting to conclude. As he worked in the office next to the conference room, Marcus couldn't help overhearing fragments of the conversation taking place behind the closed door. The discussion involved several people, including voices he recognized as belonging to David Park and Robert Blackstone, both of whom he'd encountered briefly during previous cleaning shifts. The tone was serious but not panicked, suggesting that whatever crisis they were addressing was being handled with professional competence rather than desperate improvisation. Marcus caught occasional phrases that provided context for the discussion. SEC investigators, forensic accounting, client notifications, and media strategy. The words painted a picture of a firm dealing with a significant regulatory investigation, but also suggested that the partners were approaching the situation with careful planning rather than reactive chaos. It was nearly 2:15 a.m. when the conference room door finally opened and several people emerged, continuing their conversation as they walked toward the elevator. Marcus recognized Robert Blackstone's distinctive voice as he spoke with someone about scheduling additional meetings with investigators and coordinating with the firm's legal counsel. The tone remained businesslike and determined, lacking the desperation Marcus might have expected from people facing a serious crisis. After the group left, Marcus entered the conference room to begin cleaning. The whiteboard was covered with detailed notes about investigative procedures, evidence documentation, and communication strategies. While Marcus carefully avoided reading the specific details, he could see that the meeting had involved extensive planning for what appeared to be a complex legal and regulatory process. As Marcus was erasing the whiteboard and cleaning the conference table, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. He looked up to see Victoria Chun entering the room, looking tired but alert. She was dressed in professional attire and carried a leather briefcase that suggested she'd been working late rather than just arriving at the office. "Marcus," Victoria said, her voice warm with recognition. "I was hoping I'd find you here tonight." "Miss Chun," Marcus replied, setting down his cleaning supplies. "I'm glad to see you're doing well." Victoria's expression grew serious, and she closed the conference room door behind her. "I wanted to thank you for last night," she said. "Our conversation probably saved my life." Marcus felt a weight settle in his chest as he processed the implications of her words. He'd suspected that Victoria had been in serious emotional distress, but hearing her confirm how close she'd come to harming herself made the gravity of their encounter more real. "I'm just glad you reached out to your colleague," Marcus said. "It sounds like things worked out better than you expected." "Much better," Victoria confirmed. "David had uncovered evidence that completely changed my understanding of the situation. What I thought was professional negligence on my part turned out to be criminal fraud by someone I trusted." Marcus nodded, relieved to hear that Victoria's circumstances had improved, but also curious about the broader implications of what she was describing. "Are you going to be okay? Professionally, I mean." "I think so," Victoria said. "The investigation is going to be intensive, but we have compelling evidence that I was a victim rather than a perpetrator. My colleagues are supporting me, and we have excellent legal representation." Victoria paused and looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, a recognition of the role he'd played in her survival. "I've been thinking about our conversation all day," she said. "About what you said regarding fighting versus giving up, about asking for help, being brave rather than weak. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see possibilities we've missed," Marcus replied. "You were dealing with a lot of pressure and fear. It's natural that you couldn't see all the options available to you." "It was more than that," Victoria said. "I convinced myself that I deserved what was happening to me, that I'd been careless and naive, and that accepting punishment was somehow noble. You helped me understand that taking responsibility for my mistakes didn't require sacrificing my life for someone else's crimes." Marcus thought about his own experiences with guilt and responsibility, the times when he blamed himself for circumstances beyond his control, and the gradual process of learning to distinguish between appropriate accountability and destructive self-blame. It's easy to confuse guilt with responsibility, Marcus said. Especially when you're dealing with something that affects other people you care about. Exactly, Victoria said. I was so focused on the clients who'd lost money because of my trust in Morrison that I couldn't see past my sense of personal failure. I thought the best way to take responsibility was to remove myself from the situation entirely. And now? Marcus asked. Now I realize that the best way to take responsibility is to help catch the person who actually committed the crimes and to work toward recovering the money that was stolen, Victoria said. Running away or worse wouldn't have helped anyone. Victoria reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. I wanted to give you something, she said, extending the envelope toward Marcus. Marcus looked at the envelope but didn't take it. That's not necessary, Miss Chun. I didn't help you because I expected anything in return. I know, Victoria said. But I also know that you have a daughter and that you're working multiple jobs to support her. This isn't charity or payment for services rendered. It's recognition that your time and kindness have value, and that value should be acknowledged. Marcus hesitated, torn between his instinct to refuse what felt like charity and his awareness that any additional income would genuinely help with Emma's needs and his educational expenses. What is it? He asked. It's a scholarship, Victoria said, for your continuing education. I know you're working toward a degree, and I know that balancing work and school is difficult when you have family responsibilities. Marcus stared at the envelope, processing what Victoria was offering. A scholarship would address one of his most significant financial challenges, potentially allowing him to complete his degree more quickly and transition to better-paying work. How did you know about my education plans? Marcus asked. I made some inquiries through HR, Victoria admitted. I wanted to understand more about the person who'd helped me, and I discovered that you've been taking courses toward a business degree while working 2 jobs and raising your daughter alone. Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions about Victoria's investigation into his personal circumstances. Part of him appreciated her interest in his situation, but another part felt uncomfortable with the invasion of privacy, even if it was well-intentioned. I don't know what to say, Marcus said. Say you'll accept it, Victoria replied. Not because you need charity, but because education is an investment in your future and your daughter's future. And because sometimes accepting help from others is an act of courage rather than an admission of weakness. Marcus recognized his own words from the previous night, and he understood that Victoria was challenging him to apply his advice to his own situation. He'd encouraged her to accept help from her colleagues and to fight for her future rather than giving up. Now she was asking him to do the same thing. This is very generous, Marcus said, finally taking the envelope. But I want to be clear that this doesn't create any obligation between us. If you face legal problems or professional difficulties, I can't provide assistance beyond what any citizen might offer. Victoria smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Marcus had seen from her. I understand completely, she said. This has nothing to do with my legal situation and everything to do with recognizing that you made a difference in someone's life when you didn't have to. Marcus opened the envelope and examined the scholarship documents inside. The amount was substantial, enough to cover his remaining tuition and fees with money left over for books and other educational expenses. More than that, the scholarship was structured as an ongoing program rather than a one-time payment, suggesting that Victoria had established something permanent rather than just making a personal gift. This is incredibly generous, Marcus said. But why make it a formal scholarship program rather than just helping me personally? Because you're probably not the only person in this situation, Victoria said. There are probably other working parents trying to improve their circumstances through education, other people balancing multiple responsibilities while pursuing long-term goals. This seemed like a way to help more than just one person. Marcus realized that Victoria had transformed her gratitude into something broader and more systematic, creating a program that could benefit multiple people rather than just addressing his individual situation. The approach reflected the same kind of strategic thinking that had probably made her successful in the financial world, but applied to philanthropic rather than commercial purposes. "What do you call this scholarship program?" Marcus asked. "The Emma Williams Educational Foundation," Victoria said. Marcus stared at her, shocked that she'd named the program after his daughter. "You named it after Emma?" "I hope that's okay," Victoria said. "From our conversation last night, it was clear that everything you do is motivated by your love for her and your desire to build a better future for both of you. It seemed appropriate to name the foundation after the person who inspires your efforts." Marcus felt tears threatening as he processed the implications of what Victoria had done. She'd not only provided financial assistance for his education, but she'd also honored his daughter in a way that would be permanent and meaningful. "Emma's going to be amazed when she learns about this," Marcus said. "I'd like to meet her someday, if that would be appropriate," Victoria said. "I'd like to understand more about the person who inspired her father to show such wisdom and compassion to a stranger." Marcus thought about Emma's reaction to meeting someone like Victoria, a successful businesswoman who'd established a scholarship program in her honor. Emma would probably have dozens of questions about finance and business, subjects that fascinated her even at 6 years old. "I think she'd enjoy that," Marcus said. "She's very curious about how the business world works, and she'd probably want to know everything about your job and your company." "I'd be happy to answer her questions," Victoria said. "In fact, that gives me an idea for another component of the scholarship program. Maybe we could include mentorship opportunities for recipients, ways to connect working parents with professionals who can provide guidance about career development and educational planning." Marcus could see Victoria's mind working, taking the basic concept of educational assistance and expanding it into something more comprehensive and systematic. The approach reminded him of their conversation the previous night, when she'd moved from despair to determination as soon as she had a clear problem to solve and resources to apply to solving it. "You're thinking like a business executive again," Marcus observed. "Good," Victoria said. "That's exactly how I should be thinking. Last night, I was ready to give up everything I'd worked for because I couldn't see past the immediate crisis. Tonight, I'm using the skills that made me successful in the first place to create something positive from a difficult situation." Victoria paused and looked around the conference room where they were standing, the same building where she'd nearly ended her life just 24 hours earlier. "This place feels completely different now," she said. "Yesterday it felt like a trap. Tonight, it feels like a foundation for building something better." Marcus understood what she meant. Physical spaces could feel oppressive or liberating, depending on the mental state of the people occupying them. Victoria's office had felt like a tomb when she was writing her suicide letter, but it probably felt like a workplace again now that she was approaching her problems with hope rather than despair. "What happens next with the investigation?" Marcus asked. "The SASIC investigators want to interview everyone who worked closely with Morrison," Victoria said. "They're particularly interested in understanding how he managed to access authorization systems without detection and how he convinced clients to trust him with sensitive financial information." "And you're confident they'll conclude that you weren't involved?" Marcus asked. "I'm confident that the evidence will speak for itself," Victoria said. "David Park uncovered a pattern of unauthorized computer access that clearly shows Morrison was using my credentials without my knowledge. The timestamps and access logs provide compelling proof that I was being impersonated rather than collaborating." Victoria's tone was matter-of-fact, suggesting that she was approaching the investigation as a professional challenge rather than a personal threat. The transformation from the previous night was remarkable, but Marcus understood that confidence built on solid evidence was different from confidence built on wishful thinking. "What about the money that was stolen?" Marcus asked. Will your clients be able to recover their losses? That's more complicated, Victoria admitted. Morrison transferred most of the money to offshore accounts in countries that don't have strong extradition treaties with the United States. Recovery will depend on international cooperation and Morrison's willingness to negotiate a settlement. And if he doesn't cooperate? Marcus asked. Then our clients will probably have to accept significant losses, Victoria said. That's the part of this situation that still keeps me awake at night. Innocent people trusted us with their money, and we failed to protect them from a sophisticated criminal. Marcus could hear the guilt in Victoria's voice, the ongoing struggle to balance personal responsibility with institutional accountability. She'd moved past the paralyzing self-blame that had nearly driven her to suicide, but she hadn't absolved herself of all responsibility for what had happened. You can't protect people from every possible form of deception, Marcus said. Morrison fooled everyone, not just you. He had credentials, references, and years of apparently honest performance. Holding yourself responsible for not detecting sophisticated fraud is like holding yourself responsible for not predicting natural disasters. I know that intellectually, Victoria said, but emotionally, it's harder to accept. These aren't abstract financial losses we're talking about. They're real people who trusted us with their retirement savings, their children's college funds, their life's work. Marcus thought about the weight of responsibility that came with managing other people's money, the pressure of knowing that financial decisions could affect families for generations. He'd never dealt with amounts as large as what Morrison had stolen, but he understood the anxiety that came with being responsible for outcomes beyond his direct control. What are you doing to help the clients who were affected? Marcus asked. We're working with law enforcement to trace the stolen money and with international authorities to freeze Morrison's assets, Victoria said. We're also reviewing our insurance policies to determine what coverage might be available for client losses. But beyond the technical aspects, Marcus pressed, how are you helping them cope with what happened? Victoria looked thoughtful. We're being completely transparent about the investigation and the recovery efforts, she said. We're providing regular updates about our progress and being honest about the challenges we're facing. That's important, Marcus said. But what about the emotional impact? What about the stress and anxiety they're probably feeling? Victoria paused, and Marcus could see her processing his question. I hadn't thought about that aspect as much as I should have, she admitted. I've been so focused on the legal and financial dimensions of the crisis that I haven't given adequate attention to the human cost. People who've been victimized by financial fraud often feel violated and betrayed, Marcus said. They may blame themselves for trusting someone they shouldn't have trusted, or they may develop anxiety about financial decisions in general. Marcus was drawing on his own experience with economic uncertainty and his observations of neighbors and friends who'd been affected by various financial scams and predatory lending practices. The emotional impact of financial victimization often lasted longer than the financial impact, affecting people's confidence and willingness to trust institutions. You're absolutely right, Victoria said. We should be providing counseling resources and emotional support, not just legal updates and financial projections. Marcus could see Victoria's mind working again, taking his suggestion and expanding it into a comprehensive response to the human dimensions of the crisis her firm was facing. The same strategic thinking that had gotten her into trouble by trusting Morrison without adequate oversight was now helping her develop solutions for problems she hadn't initially recognized. This is exactly the kind of perspective I need, Victoria said. I've been approaching this crisis like a technical problem to be solved rather than a human tragedy to be addressed. Both perspectives are important, Marcus said. You need to solve the technical problems to prevent similar incidents in the future, but you also need to address the human impact to maintain your client's trust and help them recover from the trauma. Victoria nodded, and Marcus could see her mentally reorganizing her approach to the crisis management process. "I'm going to recommend that we establish a victim support program," she said. "Counseling services, financial planning assistance, regular communication about the investigation progress." "That sounds like a good start," Marcus said. "But you might also want to consider bringing in someone from outside the firm to coordinate those services. Your clients might be more comfortable talking to someone who doesn't represent the company." That failed to protect them. Victoria looked at Marcus with surprise and admiration. "That's an excellent point," she said. "An independent victim advocate would provide more credibility and objectivity than anything we could offer directly." Marcus realized that he was essentially consulting on crisis management strategy for a major financial firm, despite having no formal training in that area. His insights were coming from personal experience with economic hardship and his observations of how institutions could either help or harm people during difficult times. "I should probably get back to my cleaning," Marcus said, suddenly aware that they'd been talking for nearly an hour and he still had several floors to complete. "Of course," Victoria said. "I didn't mean to keep you from your work." Marcus began gathering his cleaning supplies, but Victoria continued talking. "I want you to know that our conversation tonight has been just as valuable as the one we had yesterday," she said. "You've helped me see aspects of this situation that I was missing completely. Sometimes an outside perspective is useful." Marcus replied, "You're dealing with a lot of complex issues, and it's easy to lose sight of some dimensions when you're focused on others." "It's more than that," Victoria said. "You have insights about how institutions affect people's lives, insights that come from experience rather than theory. That's incredibly valuable." Marcus thought about Victoria's comment as he prepared to leave the conference room. He'd never considered his life experiences as a source of professional expertise, but he was beginning to understand that his perspective, as someone who'd navigated economic uncertainty and institutional bureaucracy, might offer valuable insights for people making decisions that affected others in similar situations. "Before you go," Victoria said, "I want to ask you something. Would you be interested in serving on the advisory board for the scholarship foundation we discussed?" Marcus paused, surprised by the offer. "I don't have any experience with foundation management or educational policy, but you have experience with the challenges that working parents face when trying to improve their circumstances through education," Victoria said. "You understand the barriers and obstacles that prevent people from pursuing their goals, and you understand what kinds of support would make the biggest difference." Marcus considered Victoria's proposal. Serving on an advisory board would be completely outside his previous experience, but it would also be an opportunity to help shape a program that could benefit people facing challenges similar to his own. "What would be involved?" Marcus asked. "Probably quarterly meetings to review applications, evaluate program effectiveness, and make recommendations for improvements," Victoria said. "We'd also want your input on outreach strategies to ensure we're reaching the people who need assistance most." "I'd be honored to serve in that capacity," Marcus said. "But I want to make sure I can fulfill the responsibilities properly while maintaining my work schedule and family obligations." "Of course," Victoria said. "We'll structure the commitment to be manageable for people who have full-time jobs and family responsibilities. That's the whole point of the program." Marcus realized that Victoria was approaching the scholarship foundation with the same attention to practical constraints that had characterized their entire conversation. She wasn't just offering feel-good gestures or symbolic assistance. She was developing systematic solutions to real problems faced by specific populations. "I'd like to think about it over the weekend and give you an answer on Monday," Marcus said. "Take all the time you need," Victoria said. "And if you have suggestions for other people who should be involved, I'd welcome those recommendations as well." Marcus finished gathering his cleaning supplies and prepared to leave the conference room. As he reached the door, he turned back To Victoria, who was organizing her own materials and preparing to leave for the night. "Ms. Chun," Marcus said, "I'm proud of you for fighting back instead of giving up. Not just for your own sake, but for all the people who will benefit from the programs you're creating and the example you're setting." Victoria looked up, and Marcus could see that his words had affected her deeply. "Thank you," she said quietly. "A week ago, I would never have imagined that I'd be in a position to help anyone with anything. Now I'm discovering that surviving a crisis can create opportunities to make a positive difference for other people." "That's exactly right," Marcus said. "Sometimes our worst experiences become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions." Marcus left Victoria in the conference room and continued with his cleaning routine, but his mind remained focused on their conversation and its implications. In the space of 2 nights, he'd witnessed a remarkable transformation, from a woman ready to end her life to someone actively working to improve the lives of others. More than that, Marcus had discovered that his own experiences and perspectives had value beyond his immediate family situation. The insights he'd gained from navigating economic uncertainty and institutional bureaucracy could help other people facing similar challenges, both through the Scholarship Foundation and through whatever other opportunities might emerge. As Marcus finished cleaning the 42nd floor and moved to the next level, he thought about Emma and how proud she'd be to learn that a scholarship program had been named in her honor. He also thought about the possibility of serving on an advisory board, of contributing to decisions that could affect dozens of other families trying to improve their circumstances through education. The cleaning work felt different tonight, less like a necessity and more like a choice. Marcus was still the same person doing the same job, but his understanding of his own capabilities and potential had expanded significantly. He was no longer just a janitor working to support his daughter. He was someone whose wisdom and experience could make a difference in other people's lives. The realization was both humbling and empowering. Marcus had always tried to be a good father and a reliable employee, but he'd never considered himself someone whose insights might be valuable to successful professionals dealing with complex organizational challenges. The conversations with Victoria had revealed capabilities he hadn't known he possessed and opportunities he'd never imagined pursuing. As Marcus completed his cleaning rounds and prepared to leave the building, he reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken in just 2 days. He'd entered Victoria's office expecting to return a forgotten phone and offer brief assistance to someone in distress. Instead, he'd helped save a life, inspired the creation of a scholarship program, and discovered new possibilities for his own future. The city was beginning to wake up as Marcus drove home, early morning commuters joining the late-night workers on streets that were transitioning from one day to the next. Marcus thought about the conversation he'd have with Emma later that morning, how he'd explain the scholarship program that bore her name and the opportunities it might create for their family and others. Most importantly, Marcus thought about the lesson he'd learned about the value of paying attention to other people's pain and the power of simple, human connection to transform desperate situations into opportunities for positive change. He'd always known that kindness mattered, but he'd never fully understood how much difference one conversation could make in the trajectory of someone's life. The experience had changed him as much as it had changed Victoria, opening his eyes to possibilities he'd never considered and responsibilities he'd never imagined accepting. Marcus was still a single father working multiple jobs to support his daughter, but he was also someone whose voice and perspective could influence important decisions affecting other families facing similar challenges. As Marcus parked outside his sister's apartment building and prepared to pick up Emma for breakfast, he felt a sense of anticipation about the future that he hadn't experienced in years. The immediate challenges of work and family remained the same, but the context had shifted dramatically. He was no longer just surviving day by day. He was building something larger and more meaningful, something that could benefit Emma and countless other children whose parents were working to create better opportunities for their families. 6 months after that pivotal night in the Meridian Tower, Marcus stood in a university classroom wearing his cap and gown, diploma in hand, watching Emma beam from the audience. The business degree he'd earned through evening classes and weekend study sessions represented more than personal achievement. It symbolized the transformation that began with a conversation in a corner office at 2 in the morning. Victoria Shun sat beside Emma in the graduation ceremony audience, having insisted on attending despite her busy schedule managing the aftermath of the Morrison investigation. The SEC had concluded their inquiry 3 months earlier, clearing Victoria of any wrongdoing and praising her cooperation in building the case against David Morrison. Morrison himself had been arrested in Switzerland and was awaiting extradition to face federal charges. The Emma Williams Educational Foundation had grown beyond Victoria's initial vision, providing scholarships to 47 working parents across the state. Marcus had proven invaluable as an advisory board member, his insights helping shape policies that addressed real-world barriers facing adult learners. The foundation's success had attracted attention from other philanthropists, leading to expansion. Plans that would reach hundreds of families within 5 years. More significantly, the victim support program Victoria had implemented at Blackstone and Associates had become a model for other financial firms dealing with fraud cases. The independent victim advocacy services had helped affected clients navigate both the emotional and practical challenges of financial recovery, earning recognition from industry regulators and client advocacy groups. Emma, now 7 years old, had become fascinated with business and finance after meeting Victoria and learning about the scholarship program named in her honor. She spent hours drawing organizational charts and creating pretend companies, displaying an entrepreneurial spirit that both amused and impressed the adults in her life. Marcus had accepted a position as operations coordinator at a nonprofit organization that provided financial counseling to low-income families. The role utilized both his business education and his personal understanding of economic hardship, allowing him to help families navigate the same challenges he'd faced as a single parent. The job paid significantly more than his cleaning and warehouse work, providing stability and professional satisfaction he'd never imagined possible. Victoria's career had not only survived the Morrison scandal, but had been strengthened by her response to it. Her leadership during the crisis had impressed clients and competitors alike, leading to several lucrative job offers from other firms. She'd chosen to remain at Blackstone and Associates, accepting a promotion to managing partner with a mandate to implement comprehensive ethics and oversight reforms. The relationship between Marcus and Victoria had evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to helping others overcome adversity. They met monthly for coffee to discuss foundation business and life developments, conversations that reminded both of them how much their lives had changed since that desperate night when their paths first crossed. On this graduation day, as the ceremony concluded and families gathered for photographs, Victoria approached Marcus with an envelope she'd been carrying throughout the event. "Another scholarship?" Marcus asked with a smile. "Something different this time," Victoria replied. "A job offer." Marcus opened the envelope to find a formal letter offering him a position as program director for a new initiative Victoria was launching, a consulting service that helped companies develop support systems for employees facing personal crises. The salary was double what he earned at the nonprofit, with benefits that would secure Emma's future educational needs. "You want me to help other companies create programs like the ones you developed?" Marcus asked. "I want you to help other companies understand that their employees are human beings with complex lives, not just professional resources to be managed," Victoria said. "Your perspective on how institutions can either support or abandon people during difficult times could prevent other tragedies like the one we almost experienced." Emma tugged on Marcus's graduation gown, demanding attention. "Daddy, when are we going to celebrate?" Victoria promised ice cream. Marcus laughed, lifting Emma into his arms. Right now, sweetheart. We're going to celebrate everything good. That's happened because of brave choices and kind people. As they walked toward the parking area, Victoria fell into step beside them. I've been thinking about that night in my office, she said quietly. About how close I came to making an irreversible mistake because I couldn't see past my immediate circumstances. And now? Marcus asked. Now I understand that crises are opportunities in disguise, chances to discover strengths we didn't know we had, and to build connections that can transform multiple lives, Victoria said. What started as the worst night of my life became the foundation for everything meaningful I've accomplished since. Emma, always attentive to adult conversations, looked up at Victoria with curiosity. Were you really sad that night when Daddy helped you? Victoria knelt down to Emma's eye level. Speaking with the honesty she'd learned was important when talking to children. I was very sad, Emma. I thought I had made mistakes that couldn't be fixed, and I didn't believe anyone could help me. But Daddy did help you, Emma said with the certainty of a child who trusted her father completely. Yes, he did, Victoria agreed. He reminded me that asking for help takes courage, and that even when things seem impossible, there are usually people who care enough to stand with us while we figure out solutions. Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. And now you help other people too. That's exactly right, Victoria said. When someone helps us during a difficult time, the best way to say thank you is to help someone else when they need it. As they reached their cars, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A routine cleaning shift had become a life-changing encounter that had affected not only his own family but dozens of others through the programs and initiatives that had emerged from that initial connection. The investigation into Morrison's crimes had revealed the full scope of his deception. $12 million stolen through sophisticated identity fraud, affecting 15 client families and threatening the survival of a firm built over decades of careful reputation management. But the response to the crisis had created something more valuable than what was lost: a network of support systems, advocacy programs, and educational opportunities that would benefit people for years to come. Emma insisted on riding with Victoria to the ice cream shop, chattering excitedly about her plans to start her own foundation when she grew up. Marcus followed in his own car, listening to them through the open windows as they discussed the logistics of 7-year-old philanthropy with complete seriousness. At the ice cream shop, they sat at a corner table while Emma worked her way through a sundae that was larger than her head. Victoria and Marcus talked about the consulting firm proposal, discussing how they could scale their approach to help other organizations develop more humanized crisis response systems. The key insight, Victoria said, is that most institutional failures happen because organizations focus on protecting themselves instead of supporting the people affected by problems. If companies approached crises as opportunities to demonstrate their values rather than threats to their reputation, everyone would benefit. Marcus agreed, thinking about his own experiences with bureaucratic indifference and the contrast with Victoria's response to her firm's scandal. The difference is whether you see people as problems to be managed or as human beings deserving support and respect. Emma looked up from her ice cream, sticky but satisfied. Are you going to work together now? She asked. We've been working together for months, Marcus pointed out. I mean work together every day, Emma clarified. Like partners. Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances, both recognizing that Emma had articulated something they'd been circling around in their professional discussions. The consulting firm would be more effective if it combined Victoria's business expertise with Marcus's understanding of how institutional policies affected individual lives. What do you think about that idea, Emma? Victoria asked. Should your daddy and I be business partners? Emma considered the question with the gravity of a board member evaluating a merger proposal. Will you still be friends? She asked. Always, Victoria assured her. Then yes, Emma decided. Partners should be friends first. Marcus realized that his 7-year-old daughter had just provided the clearest guidance for their business relationship that either of them could have articulated. Their partnership would work because it was built on genuine friendship and shared values rather than just professional convenience. As they finished their ice cream and prepared to leave, Victoria handed Emma a small wrapped package. "A graduation gift," she explained, "to celebrate your daddy's achievement and your role in inspiring the foundation." Emma unwrapped the package to reveal a small leather journal with her name embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, Victoria had written, "For Emma Williams, future philanthropist and current inspiration. Your ideas matter, your dreams are important, and your compassion can change the world." Emma clutched the journal to her chest, already planning the important thoughts she would record in its pages. Marcus felt tears threatening as he watched. His daughter's joy, remembering the desperation he'd felt just months earlier about affording her art supplies and educational opportunities. The drive home took them past the Meridian Tower, its glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun. Marcus pointed out the building to Emma, explaining that it was where he'd met Victoria and where their lives had changed direction through a simple act of human kindness. "It looks normal," Emma observed, studying the building from her car seat. "Most important places do," Marcus replied. "The magic isn't in the buildings themselves, but in the people who choose to help each other inside them." That evening, as Marcus tucked Emma into bed, she asked about the job offer Victoria had presented at graduation. "Will you take the new job, Daddy?" Marcus had been weighing the decision throughout the day, considering both the professional opportunity and the impact on their family routine. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should help more people the way you helped Victoria," Emma said, with characteristic directness. "She was really sad, and you made her happy again. If you can do that for other people, you should." Marcus kissed his daughter goodnight, marveling at her ability to cut through complexity and identify what truly mattered. The salary and benefits were attractive, but Emma was right about the real value of the opportunity, the chance to help other people navigate crises with dignity and support rather than isolation and despair. The next morning, Marcus called Victoria to accept the position. They spent an hour discussing their vision for the consulting firm, their approach to client relationships, and their commitment to measuring success not just in financial terms, but in human impact. "There's something else I want to discuss," Victoria said near the end of their conversation. "I've been invited to speak at a conference about crisis management and corporate responsibility. I'd like you to co-present with me to provide the perspective of someone who's seen how institutional policies affect individuals and families." Marcus felt a moment of anxiety about public speaking, then remembered Emma's advice about helping more people. "I'd be honored to do that," he said. "The conference theme is leadership through adversity," Victoria continued. "I thought we could talk about how personal crises can become catalysts for positive change, both for individuals and for organizations." Marcus realized that their story had become something larger than either of them had anticipated. A case study in how human connection could transform desperate situations into opportunities for growth and service. The conference presentation would be a chance to share insights that might help other people avoid the isolation and despair that had nearly cost Victoria her life. Over the following weeks, Marcus transitioned out of his nonprofit position and began working with Victoria to establish their consulting firm. They named it Crossroads Consulting, reflecting their belief that crises were decision points that could lead either to deterioration or to transformation. Their first client was a technology company dealing with an embezzlement scandal similar to the one that had affected Blackstone and Associates. Instead of focusing solely on legal compliance and damage control, Crossroads Consulting helped the company implement employee support programs, victim advocacy services, and communication strategies that prioritize transparency and healing. over reputation management. The approach proved successful both practically and financially. The technology company not only avoided the devastating client losses that typically followed financial scandals, but actually strengthened its market position by demonstrating genuine commitment to ethical business practices and stakeholder support. Word of their success spread quickly through professional networks, leading to additional clients and speaking opportunities. Marcus found himself in boardrooms and conference halls, sharing insights about the human dimensions of organizational crisis management with executives who'd never considered how their policies affected employees' personal lives. Emma adapted to her father's new professional status with typical 7-year-old pragmatism, proudly telling her classmates that her daddy helped sad grown-ups feel better about their work problems. She'd begun keeping a journal of her own philanthropic ideas, planning foundations and programs she wanted to create when she was old enough to implement them. The Emma Williams Educational Foundation continued growing, having awarded scholarships to over 100 families by the end of its first year. The success stories were remarkable: single parents earning degrees, career changers developing new skills, and families breaking cycles of economic limitation through education and training opportunities. Marcus served on the foundation board, alongside educators, social workers, and other professionals who brought diverse perspectives to their decision-making process. His voice carried particular weight because he'd experienced the challenges firsthand, understanding both the barriers that prevented people from pursuing education and the support systems that made success possible. One evening, as Marcus was reviewing scholarship applications in his home office, Emma appeared in the doorway with her journal and a serious expression. "Daddy, I've been thinking about Victoria's story," she said, settling into the chair beside his desk. "What about it?" Marcus asked, setting aside his work to give her full attention. She was really smart and successful, but she still felt hopeless, Emma said. "If that can happen to someone like her, it can happen to anyone." Marcus was struck by his daughter's insight. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Success and money don't protect people from feeling overwhelmed or isolated. So everyone needs someone like you," Emma concluded. "Someone who pays attention and cares enough to help." Marcus realized that Emma had articulated the core principle underlying all their work: the universal need for human connection and support during difficult times. Crisis management wasn't really about policies and procedures. It was about ensuring that people facing challenges knew they weren't alone and had access to resources that could help them navigate their difficulties. "What are you writing in your journal?" Marcus asked. Emma showed him a page covered with her careful handwriting and colorful drawings. "Ideas for helping kids whose parents are sad at work," she said. "Like art therapy and playground time and special snacks that make people feel better." Marcus studied his daughter's plans, recognizing the same compassionate problem-solving approach that had characterized Victoria's response to the Morrison crisis. Emma was already thinking like a philanthropist, identifying problems and developing systematic solutions rather than just offering sympathy. "These are excellent ideas," Marcus said. "When you're older, we might be able to implement some of them through the foundation." "How much older?" Emma asked with typical impatience. "Old enough to understand complex financial systems and legal requirements," Marcus replied diplomatically. Emma considered this timeline, then brightened. "Can I practice by helping with small things now?" Marcus thought about Emma's request, recognizing her genuine desire to contribute meaningfully to their work rather than just being celebrated as an inspiration. "What kind of small things?" "Maybe I could write thank you notes to scholarship recipients," Emma suggested. "Or draw pictures for their children so they know someone cares about their families too." Marcus was touched by his daughter's thoughtfulness and impressed by her understanding that scholarship recipients were real people with children who might also need encouragement and support. "I think those are wonderful ideas," he said. "I'll talk to Victoria about incorporating them into our program." The conversation with Emma reminded Marcus of how much their lives had changed since that night in Victoria's office. Emma had grown. From a 6-year-old worried about art supplies into a 7-year-old planning charitable programs. Marcus had evolved from a janitor working multiple jobs into a business partner developing innovative approaches to crisis management. Victoria had transformed from a desperate executive contemplating suicide into a successful entrepreneur, creating systematic solutions for organizational and individual challenges. Most importantly, they'd all learned that personal crises could become foundations for meaningful service to others, that surviving difficult times created both the motivation and the capability to help other people facing similar challenges. A year after the graduation ceremony, Crossroads Consulting had grown into a respected firm with a dozen employees and clients across multiple industries. The Emma Williams Educational Foundation had expanded into 3 states, providing comprehensive support services that included not just tuition assistance, but also childcare, career counseling, and peer mentorship programs. Marcus and Victoria were invited to speak at conferences regularly, sharing their story and their insights about crisis management, institutional responsibility, and the power of human connection to transform desperate situations into opportunities for positive change. Emma, now 8 years old, had become the unofficial mascot of both organizations, attending events where appropriate and charming audiences, with her precocious understanding of philanthropy and social responsibility. Her journal had grown into multiple volumes of ideas for helping people, detailed plans that impressed adults with their creativity and compassion. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Victoria and Marcus returned to the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower. The cleaning shift was handled by a different company now, but Marcus had arranged for access to show Victoria how different the space felt when approached with hope rather than despair. They stood in the conference room where they'd had their second conversation, looking out at the city lights that had witnessed their transformation from strangers into friends, from individual survival into collaborative service. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been working that night?" Victoria asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think someone else would have found you eventually," he said. "Maybe a security guard, maybe a colleague, maybe someone else who cared enough to pay attention. The universe has a way of providing help when people need it most. But it might not have been the right person at the right time with the right words," Victoria pointed out. "That's true," Marcus agreed. "But I think the real lesson isn't about luck or timing. It's about the importance of being ready to help when opportunities arise and being willing to accept help when we need it ourselves." Victoria nodded, understanding that their story was ultimately about human connection rather than coincidence, about the choice to see other people's pain and respond with compassion rather than indifference. As they prepared to leave the building, Marcus thought about Emma waiting at home with his sister, probably working on her latest philanthropic plans or practicing the presentation she'd been invited to give at an upcoming foundation event. The elevator descended through floors that had once represented just work locations, but now symbolized the vertical journey they'd all taken from desperation to hope, from individual struggle to collaborative success, from surviving crisis to transforming it into opportunities for service. When the elevator doors opened in the lobby, Marcus and Victoria stepped out together, partners in business and friendship, walking toward a future built on the foundation of a conversation that had saved one life and changed many others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.